Iran and the United States, they've been adversaries for decades, but now could the battle against Islamic State fighters bring them together? And what impact could that have in reaching a deal on Iran's nuclear program? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. It's been 35 years since relations between the United States and Iran imploded during the Iran hostage crisis. Relations between the two countries never recovered. Now, as the United States is leading a war against Islamic State fighters in Iraq and Syria, there may be some common ground between the U.S. and Iran. Both nations are threatened by ISIL. At the recent United Nations meeting in New York, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said that in the fight against ISIL, quote, there is a role for nearly every country in the world to play, including Iran. But Iran and the U.S. are also engaged in sensitive talks over the future of Iran's nuclear program. And at the same UN meeting last week, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani insisted any cooperation on fighting ISIL hinges on a nuclear deal.
A final accord regarding Iran's peaceful nuclear program can serve as the beginning of multilateral collaboration aimed at promoting security, peace, and development in our region and beyond.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Barack Obama is sending his own signals.
My message to Iran's leaders and people has been simple and consistent. Do not let this opportunity pass. We can reach a solution that meets your energy needs while assuring the world that your program is peaceful.
And any potential cooperation between the United States and Iran is being watched very closely by Israel, which insists Iran should never be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. Israel says a nuclear Iran would pose an even greater danger to the region.
ISIS must be defeated. But to defeat ISIS and leave Iran as a threshold nuclear power is to win the battle and lose the war.
So, is Washington softening its stance towards Iran to win its cooperation in dealing with Islamic State? Well, joining me now in the studio is Hillary Mann Leverett. She's had 25 years of experience in U.S. foreign policy. And Hillary, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The United States has now declared war on ISIL. Notwithstanding the merits of that decision, does Washington need Iran in prosecuting this war?
Iran is an absolutely essential country player to any and every major issue in the Middle East. It's why I wrote my book, Going to Tehran, Why the United States Must Accept the Islamic Republic, because it is a critically important country in terms of its strategic location, its demography, its hydrocarbon resources, and its form of government. It is absolutely vital that they be part of any solution for any problem and part of a constructive path forward. So they will be a part of this. But whether they're going to join up with some US-led military coalition against Sunni Muslims, that's something that's not going down very well in Tehran.
So publicly, they can't announce any kind of alliance?
Both publicly and I think in practice, though they may benefit from any military sites that the United States can take out of ISIL. They're under no illusions that there's a real military solution being brought to the United States by the Middle East. After the disastrous US-led military operations in Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan, they're under no illusions that the United States this time is somehow going to get it right militarily in Iraq. They recall that the United States spent 8 years, $1 trillion, and 125,000 soldiers, and we couldn't do anything to quell ISIL and its precursor Al-Qaeda in Iraq before that. So they're under no illusion that that kind of strategy and coalition is going to work, and they are certainly not eager to join it.
But Iran is already involved, isn't it? I mean, to what extent is it involved? Because we know, for instance, that there's been a very senior commander of the Al-Quds force who's been in Iraq, and there's now talk of Iran supplying weapons to fighters in Lebanon.
Iran has had a strategy, a military, a political, economic strategy vis-a-vis Iraq, Lebanon, the entire region for some time that has been on its own terms quite successful and quite effective in terms of protecting Iran's sovereignty and its growth as a governing system in the region. In particular, their strategy vis-a-vis Iraq has been very successful. It's hard for us to accept that, but they have cultivated, not just armed, trained, and funded, but educated, fed, clothed Iraqi oppositionists in Iran for decades, not just Shia, but Kurds. So almost the entire Iraqi Shia leadership has spent some time in Iran, not getting arms and training per se, or just that alone, but going to the schools, being educated, fed, and taken care of. The same can be said for many, many among the Kurdish leadership. So Iran has that kind of political tie, those relationships that enable it to send in small numbers, relatively small numbers of advisors, even at times troops, to help their already existing relationships and groups of fighters and those vying for political influence. So that has protected them, particularly in the south, certainly in Baghdad, and has given them an important platform to contain and push ISIL further away from the Kurdish areas.
But in this relationship with the United States, are we seeing something of a linkage being announced here by President Rouhani, in which he's saying, look, okay, we will cooperate with you in this fight against ISIL, but we need to see some progress on the nuclear talks?
I'm not so sure the Iranians are laying down an offer to the United States that they would join a U.S.-led military coalition under these circumstances, that is being prosecuted in defiance of the government of Syria and without a Security Council resolution. I'm really not sure the Iranians are putting that on the table. But what I think the Iranians are saying, which is critically important and not well heard here in Washington, or I think even around the world, is even though there is a meeting of the minds over the threat ISIL poses to Iraq, to Iran, to the region and the world, that instead of being able to join together to cooperate against that threat, the U.S. approach is undermining Iranian confidence, not only in the American ability to deal with that threat, but in the American ability to come to terms with Iran over the nuclear issue. Because for Iran, there's always been an underlying sense that the nuclear issue was pretextual, that it wasn't about proliferation, that it was about subordinating Iran's sovereignty. That is now being amplified by the American approach to Syria and Iraq, where the United States has declared, and most American elites, that Assad has lost all right to sovereignty and we could do whatever we want. The determination to stick to that approach and to arm, fund, and train yet more Syrian Sunni militant fighters is underlining the concern in Iran that what the United States is doing is trying to condition Middle Eastern states' sovereignty and use the nuclear issue to subordinate Iran. So it's making harder to get to a deal.
But that is a completely new issue. It's outside the realm of what we're talking about right now. You were in New York last week when Rouhani was there at the UN General Assembly. He met a wide spectrum of people. He met some very senior analysts and experts, yourself included, in New York. Was that the concern he expressed?
Very much so, because in some of the meetings that I was in, some of them were with other elite American foreign policy elites. They were uniformly focused on how President Assad in Syria had lost sovereignty, and therefore the U.S. military coalition and what it was doing was justified. You could just see in the body language that President Rouhani bristled at that, and this idea that the United States could dictate terms to Syria and also to Iran on the nuclear issue was something that Iran had to take even more seriously than it had over the past year, and had to look at the potential compromises that it has on the table vis-a-vis the P5+1, the negotiating context for the nuclear issue. In that context, that Iran has to be even more careful today than it was a year ago about the kinds of compromises it could agree to.
So if that is the issue, you know, legitimacy, sovereignty, if that is the issue that is preoccupying the minds of policymakers in Iran, what are the chances of a nuclear deal then?
I think they're pretty low. And you saw even President Obama in his speech to the United Nations, he stressed to the Iranian people and Iranian leaders, and again, he doesn't use the name the Islamic Republic of Iran, their legally recognized name, but he says to them, you have a right to energy. He talks about their rights to energy. He doesn't talk about their rights to sovereignty, to make these decisions on their own. So I think this is overcasting the potential for a deal. The time is very short. November 24th is the self-imposed deadline. If they don't come to a consensus on principles in the next 2 weeks, it's hard to see how there can be a deal. And I left New York more pessimistic than I've been in some time.
Would Iran be open to another extension?
Senior Iranian officials are saying they don't see the utility. They don't see what that buys Iran, because for the past year, Iran has been scrupulously abiding by the interim agreement and restricting and restricting its own nuclear activities in exchange for very little financial relief. For the Iranians to continue that without any lifting of sanctions doesn't really serve any purpose for them other than to look good in a U.S. audience.
You know, this crisis has made for some very strange bedfellows, as we've seen. You know, we're talking now about Iran and the United States getting together. Some Syrian politicians have made statements saying, well, we support the American bombing of the country. How would other U.S. allies in the region be looking at this? I'm talking especially about Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Well, I think this is why the Saudis made it really a quid pro quo, that they would only join this U.S.-led military coalition to bomb ISIS or ISIL, whether it's in Iraq or Syria, if the United States agreed to publicly support the arming and training of even more Syrian Sunni militants in Saudi Arabia, because the Saudis are focused on bringing down Assad and ensuring that the regional balance of power weakens Syria and Iran. So that was, I think, quid pro quo, and the Saudis have joined that in order to get American support, again, against Iran, against the Syrian government. So the Saudis have reacted in a pretty strategic way as far as they see their own interest. Extract what they can from the Americans and give them this token sign of support in fighting ISIS.
Right, and then it brings us back to a point that we have talked about before on this show, and that is U.S. strategy. Is there a strategy here? Because it seems, again, that there's no game plan here. There's no end game.
You know, I often think of Albert Einstein and his, his famous quote that doing the same thing over and over again and thinking that there'll be a different result is the definition of insanity. We have been arming, training, and funding Sunni militants from Afghanistan to Libya to Iraq to Syria now for decades. And the only thing that we get back is literally an explosive backlash and the undermining and eroding of American power, influence, and credibility. So we know where this sorry tale has gone before and where it's likely to go now.
Hillary Mann Leverett, thanks again for joining us.
Great
insights. Thank you. We are going to take a break right now. Coming up, does the U.S. need Iran more than Tehran needs Washington? We'll take a look at that. You're watching The Heat.